Okay, now it's me. So everyone's going to go home now with this image ingrained on their minds because we've seen it so many times. I'm kind of going to take the logical progression from Angela and talk about some of the challenges and opportunities around accessible fieldwork in higher education. And for the first part of the talk, I'm going to focus on a couple of challenges that I think have already kind of cropped up in questioning that are really external constraints. They're things that are imposed on universities and are really outside of our control, but do present very significant barriers. And then for the second part of the talk, I'm going to focus in on the design and delivery of accessible fieldwork, and I am going to be focusing mainly on the Vancouver field trip from last year. And, I mean, if you take a look at this kind of very happy-looking group of people, it presents an image of fieldwork that's really very diverse. We've got a real mix of genders, we've got a mix of ages, we've got a few people that are obviously from a different ethnic background, but most importantly, we have an image of people participating in fieldwork who clearly have a disability. And the people with the kind of obvious visual disabilities, you could probably count about 5. As Chris said, half of this group actually self-declare as having a disability. So as an image of fieldwork, this is actually a really diverse image. And it's interesting to compare it with some of these images that are very typical of university websites and prospectuses and marketing materials. And similar points to what Edmund was saying earlier. Oh, and these are all from Plymouth University, by the way, so I'm not shaming anybody else's institution here. This presents a particular image of fieldwork that's very appealing to the majority of students that would come from Angela's college, for example, or from most of the secondary schools that feed our institutions. And it presents fieldwork in a way that looks exciting and challenging, and it takes place in out-of-the-way places that can look remote and inaccessible, but are very exotic because of that. So for your student that's young and fit and able-bodied, predominantly white, these images present a vision of fieldwork that is really appealing, and it makes students want to come in and do our subjects. But for a student with a disability, there are significant barriers here. I mean, we have in this image here, this is quite an obvious physical barrier. You know, if somebody has a physical mobility issue, are they really going to be comfortable about being faced with something like this? But also, for a person with a disability, just looking at the people in this image, it's not people that look or feel like them. So, you've got a social barrier there as well. So I think even before we start getting into the logistics and the practicalities of accessible fieldwork, we need to be thinking about some of the images that we present and whether they're actually accessible to begin with. So I'm going to be focusing on 3 main barriers first of all, and this is just a great quote because it sums up the importance of talking about these issues, because what we're trying to do, and what Edmund highlighted in his introduction, is that in order to encourage more people to come into the geosciences and go on to be part of our geoscience profession, we need to get over these barriers to them participating so that they can become geoscientists and really excel. So the barriers I want to talk about, I want to talk about financial barriers, and in particular the forthcoming changes to the Disabled Students Allowance, because that's going to have some fairly significant impacts on universities. I want to say something about benchmarking and accreditation, because there again we have some external constraints, particularly around the amount and type of fieldwork, that need to be discussed if we're going to look seriously at making fieldwork more accessible. And then I'm going to move on to talk about fieldwork design and delivery and use a Vancouver field trip as a case study for that. So just looking at some of the background information, and I think Edmund was probably reporting data that's more up to date than this, because you were saying it was just under 12% of all students have a disability. This data runs from 2003-04 to 2012-13, and at this point it was about 9.5% of all students had a disability. I think the interesting point, or the important point, is that there is a very clear upward trend. And we are encouraging a greater proportion of students into higher education who are declaring a disability. And I think that's a very, very good thing. We are becoming more inclusive in general, but we need to think very carefully about what the implications for this are in terms of fieldwork. Oh, and incidentally, at our institution at Plymouth, we actually have around about 16% of all students who declare a disability. So we're actually higher than the national average. Not entirely sure why, but maybe they just want to be by the sea. So if we focus in and look at the data for STEM disciplines, we can get a bit of a clearer idea about the types of issues that we're likely to be faced with when we're thinking about accessible fieldwork. So what's not on this list is dyslexia, and it's round about 50% of students that self-declare a disability will have dyslexia somewhere in that mix. But if we look at the other range of conditions, what we see is that for hearing and visual impairments, over the course of this decade, the numbers, so not the proportion, the numbers, have stayed reasonably constant, maybe dipped a little bit. We've seen an increase in students with some kind of physical impairment, but where we're seeing a very significant increase is in students coming with a mental health issue or with social and communication issues. So this would be autism and Asperger's. And it's not entirely clear why that is, whether it reflects the widening of participation in higher education in general, whether it's to do with improved diagnosis, whether it's simply the fact that more students are prepared to declare a disability. The important thing about these particular conditions is that they are largely unseen. And so it's much, much more difficult to recognise what the issues are that we need to be taking into consideration when we're thinking about accessible fieldwork. So if we just look at the issue with disabled students' allowances. At the moment, if a student declares a disability, they are eligible for funding from the government, and it's actually quite generous. So there is money available for things like computers and assistive technologies. There's money available for textbooks, for printing, for papers, general consumables. And there's also a pretty generous allowance available for what's technically termed non-medical helpers. The term we more frequently use is enablers. So these are individuals that are employed to support learners with disabilities across the whole range of learning environments, not just in the field. So at the moment, our students can apply for funding from the government, and it's non-means tested. It's given purely on the basis of the student's condition, doesn't have to be repaid, and it's available across the whole range of conditions. So it includes issues like dyslexia and mental health issues. But that's changing. So from the 2016-17 academic year, the government are withdrawing the disabled students' allowance for the majority of these conditions. And what makes this slightly more complicated is that in the first instance, the DSA is being withdrawn for students that are domiciled within England. So if a student lives in England and goes to university in England, they lose their DSA. If they're domiciled in England and go to university in Scotland, they lose their DSA. If a student's domiciled in Scotland and goes to university in Scotland, they retain their DSA for the time being. So there's some interesting issues around there. But in terms of fieldwork, the most significant issue, I would argue, is this potential loss of funding for enablers, because these are the individuals that will accompany a student with disabilities on a field trip. So thinking about some of the conditions that Angela was talking about just now, there would be a person dedicated to those students to focus on them and their needs. And the funding for that, apart from in the most extreme cases, is going to be withdrawn. And that's going to have a fairly significant impact in terms of the design and delivery of accessible fieldwork. And at the moment, it's just under 50% of all students that declare a disability who are claiming the DSA. So not all students claim it, but about half of them do. And within the physical sciences, as Edmund said, there's round about 12%. There's about 12% of students currently in the physical sciences who declare a disability. And if we look at the data over the past decade, there has been, again, an increasing trend in the proportion of students that are claiming DSA. So by removing this funding, it is going to have an impact on the students that come to do our geoscience degrees. Okay, so that is an issue with funding that maybe when we go into our discussion groups later on, people might want to pick up and have a more in-depth discussion about. Another issue that I just want to touch on is to do with benchmarking and accreditation. So for the benefit of my overseas colleagues, so for Chris and Miguel, in the UK there are kind of defined criteria that our students need to achieve in order to graduate from a UK degree. And these are known as benchmark statements. And the benchmark statements cover the whole range of aspects of learning, and they also include fieldwork. So we've got the benchmark statements here for ES3, which includes earth science and environmental science, and also for geography. And these are some of the statements that they make about the role of fieldwork within these degree programmes. And essentially what these benchmark statements say is that in order for a student to graduate from a UK university in one of these geoscience degrees, they must complete a component of fieldwork. It's a compulsory part of their degree. So it's not an option for students to go through an undergraduate programme and simply not participate in fieldwork. It's made a little bit more complicated for students on geology and earth science programmes, in that the majority of these degree programmes are accredited by the Geological Society. And the Geological Society, as part of that accreditation, stipulate a minimum number of field days that students must spend in the field, and of those field days, a number must be spent independent mapping. Now, depending on the exact flavour of that degree, those numbers do vary, but for a student coming in to do a 3-year BSc straightforward geology programme, you're looking at a minimum of 60 days in the field over 3 years, of which over 3 weeks are expected to be spent independent mapping. So you can see that for a student with disabilities who are already kind of encountering some of these mental and physical barriers to engaging with fieldwork, actually that could be quite an issue for them to consider. So I think, first of all, there's quite an interesting tension in that the Geological Society have made a very, very public commitment to enhancing the engagement of students with disabilities into their subjects, but the Geological Society are also responsible for accrediting a lot of our degrees and defining the amount of time that students need to spend in the field. So again, I think there's a very interesting discussion to be had, maybe today, between universities and the Geological Society around accreditation and the provision of accessible fieldwork. So those are the two barriers that are really kind of externally imposed constraints, if you like, and that are outside the control of universities. Where institutions have much more control is in the design and delivery of their own fieldwork. So if we're talking about making fieldwork accessible, there are a range of other challenges and issues that we need to start considering. And this list is by no means exhaustive. It's just some of the main issues that we need to think about. And one of the things we need to think about, obviously, is making fieldwork inclusive. And one of the things that we know, particularly about geology fieldwork, is that there is a real culture that goes with fieldwork, and that culture can make it exclusive to a whole range of different elements of the student population, not just students with disabilities. So we do need to consider that. When we design a field activity, it needs to be inclusive and not make anybody feel that they are left out in any way, whether it's through their age, their gender, their sexual orientation, or their physical or mental issues. Meeting the desired learning outcomes. Chris mentioned this in his talk about focusing on the learning outcomes and focusing on the academic rigour rather than the physical rigour. And the issue that we have in the UK also goes back to the benchmark statements, in that at each stage of a student's degree they are expected to attain certain levels in terms of academic knowledge and skills. So it's making sure that those targets are also met. if we're going to lose funding for enablers, which is potentially a lot of money, how is that going to be addressed? Will it simply be a case that universities say, okay, it's so important that we maintain that one-to-one level of support, we will actually find the money from within our institutions to continue to fund that enabler support? Or will they recognise it as being an opportunity to think differently about the way the fieldwork is designed and delivered and look more to a peer support type of model? So again, an interesting discussion around that. And then finally, training and resources. And this is something that Chris is looking to develop through the IAGD. I know that when I did my training in teaching in higher education, I wasn't really given any instruction in how to support learners with disabilities in a field context. I kind of learned on the job. I learned a huge amount from being in Vancouver last year. There are some pre-existing resources. Back in the early 2000s, Mick Healy and a team at Gloucestershire University put together a really fantastic set of documents around supporting learners in the field with a whole range of different disabilities, and yet people don't really seem to have picked up on them, and we're over a decade on and we're still talking about these issues. So one of the things we'd really like to do is to try to increase the visibility of some of these resources and training for staff in terms of supporting students. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the exciting stuff. This is the accessible sea-to-sky highway field trip from the Geological Society of America annual conference last year. So this is Vancouver. This is a shot of Vancouver taken when Chris and his colleague Brett were out scoping the trip. It didn't necessarily look like that on the day. The sky wasn't as blue. And the field trip itself was based around a pre-existing field trip that Brett Gilley at University of British Columbia has been running for years. So it was basically taking something that already existed and retrofitting it to make it accessible to students with a wide range of different disabilities. And it involved using Highway 99, which is a sea-to-sky highway, as a way to access all kinds of different aspects of the regional geology. And we went through coastal processes, geohazards, engineering, igneous, glacial. There was a whole range of different things that we were able to experience. 15 students, 15 academics, all out in the field together, experiencing the geology and thinking about accessible field work. So just to recap on the aims, the main one was to get everybody out in the field and working in partnership and learning from each other and creating this learning community, finding out what it means for fieldwork to be really accessible. And then the second part, which is still ongoing, and which we'd like to try and engage people more broadly in, is to promote outcomes from this type of accessible fieldwork by compiling guidelines and resources to help with the design and delivery of future accessible fieldwork. So to think about the kinds of resources that we need to provide to our colleagues in our institutions to help them to make their fieldwork more accessible. And as Chris said, of the participants that we had on the field trip, almost half of them self-identified as having some kind of a learning, physical or cognitive disability. So we had people that were visually impaired, hearing impaired, mobility impaired, autistic, learning disabilities, and on quite a wide range of the spectrum as well. So in terms of diversity, we actually had a much greater range of diversity than you would expect to encounter on a typical geology field trip. So we kind of didn't really make things that easy for ourselves, but it did allow us to take into account the widest range of possible issues that we may be faced with in terms of undergraduate fieldwork. Oh, and just to say, this guy here, we had GSA TV come and accompany us for the morning of the field trip, and they made a little film which was played on a loop throughout the conference, and if anybody's interested, we can probably find that at lunchtime and play it. It gives a really good overview of what was going on and what we did. And my role in this field trip was to carry out some research along with Tony Faig from Central Michigan University, and it was very much an ethnographic approach, so interviewing the students before and after and being out on the field work with the students and the staff, trying to get a real sense of what their experience was. And one of the things I was really interested in was their prior experiences of fieldwork, because your prior experiences of anything will inform your attitudes and your feelings towards that particular thing at a future point in time. So if you've had a very good experience of something, you would have good expectations and positive expectations for how that would proceed in the future, and kind of the contrary if it's been negative. And when I spoke to the students, they hadn't had universally negative experiences by a long shot. A lot of them had very positive things to say. But there were certain things and themes that kept occurring. So this feeling of being the odd person out, I don't fit in. The feeling of being misunderstood. And this was particularly with students that had a mobility issue or a mental health issue that wasn't immediately obvious, where you looked at them and wouldn't know by looking at them that they had some kind of disability. And because it wasn't obvious, they felt that they weren't understood by their colleagues. This feeling of being left behind, and again this comes back to Chris's, you know, everyone just gets out the bus and runs up that mountain, and you've got these students, as this one says here, sitting back saying, what just happened? Where is everybody? What the hell's going on? And then you feel like you're the weakest link. So these were comments that kept coming up while I was talking to these students. And the underlying theme here is exclusion. So that's one of the big barriers that we need to get over. And that's all linked into these social barriers that accompany the physical barriers that can go with traditional fieldwork. So one of the things that Chris and Brett were very conscious to try to factor in when they designed this accessible fieldwork was creating this sense of community and overcoming these social barriers. And the way that they did this was by using a field buddy system. So every student was paired with a member of academic staff, and at least one of those pair had some kind of disability. And the idea was that they worked in partnership. So it wasn't you're the student, I'm the academic staff. It's we're buddies, we're working together. And that was great because from the minute that everybody got on the bus in the morning, everybody had someone to talk to and somebody that they knew was there to look out for them and to advocate for them and to make sure that they were okay. So that anxiety of what happens if I don't feel well? What happens if I can't, you know, who can I talk to? Was removed right from the outset. And of course, as the trip progressed, and I'm delighted to see that, I started to see that happen today, people started to talk to each other and people started to mix and find out about other people's experiences. And it really helped to create this sense of a learning community where ultimately everybody was there and working together. So that was a really good way to start to make things more socially inclusive. You've already seen this picture. Another way that we can make fieldwork more inclusive is through the resources that we use, and particularly in terms of presenting information in different formats, because different people take in information in different ways. So these are the tactile maps, and again, here's our completely forced picture of one of our students with visual impairments interacting with that map and getting a sense of the spatial distribution of the geology and where the different field stops are in relation to each other. And it was great because everybody pretty much had a go on the tactile map and everybody had a different experience with it. And I think what that really demonstrated is that we all have the potential to interact with geology and with learning in different ways. And I think within the geoscience subjects, we do privilege the visual. We talk about observation. It's a very fundamental part of our subject, and rightly so. But seeing is not the only way that we can engage with our subject and with geology. There are all these other senses that we can use that can add to the way that we learn. And it's really interesting to speak to students with disabilities about how learning for them is much more of a multisensory experience. And they do bring in touch and sound and some of the other more bodily senses much more readily to create a very different way of learning. So I think we can think about being a little bit more multisensory. And we can communicate with people in different ways as well. I mean, I know the typical thing with a field trip is to give everyone a handout as they get on the bus, and then they read it on the bus and all get off feeling terribly car sick, and haven't really taken in, and then have to spend 10 minutes reading through it again, blah, 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 blah. There's other ways that we can communicate with people about what's being done and what we want to achieve. This student here, this was our hard of hearing student, and he was paired up with this field buddy, and she was fluent in American Sign Language. Unfortunately, our student wasn't. There was a bit of a disconnect there. So they had to find a way very quickly of being able to communicate with each other, or he was going to be lost for the whole day. And the way they did it was using a mobile phone, because it turned out that his field buddy was an absolute demon texter. And she was so good at it that she could actually keep him engaged pretty much in real time in the conversations and the context and the instruction and everything that was going on throughout the whole day. So it was just a different way of being able to communicate with the students. And here again, this is one of our visually impaired students, and she's just scrambled up, literally, a steep scree slope to get to this outcrop which has an igneous dike. So this is something that she's heard about but has never experienced in real life. And this experience of feeling the difference between the different rock types and the contact and getting a sense for the scale and the geometry was one of the real highlights of her trip. And it was also one of the highlights of other people's trip as well, to see the way that she responded. So there's lots of ways that people can interact with the geology. And when I talked to the students afterwards, what they said to me was, well, it was pretty much like all the other geology trips that we've been on, except you made it so anybody could do it. And the accommodations that were made, really, and you need to talk to Chris in more detail about exactly what the logistics were, but they weren't huge. They weren't massive changes that were made. It was things like addressing the pace, the way that information was presented, the way that people worked together. But they made a massive difference in terms of accommodating learners with a whole range of different disabilities. And when I did my post-fieldwork interviews, one of the final questions that I asked the students was, when you look back on this experience in 10 years' time, when you talk to your grandkids, that sort of thing, what's the one thing that you will talk about? What's the one thing you're most likely to remember? And sure, a lot of people talked about the amazing landscape and the rocks and the geology, but what most people talked about was who they were with. So again, it brings back the importance of providing that social context and that feeling of inclusivity, because that's what people remember and that's what really engages people with the learning. And this is a great quote. This is a quote from one of our students who's actually he was a postgrad, so he'd already been through the whole undergrad and all the associated fieldwork. And what he was saying was, when I've been on fieldwork before, there's been all these barriers that have created anxiety. And because they've created anxiety, that's been a barrier to me engaging with the learning. But by just making this fieldwork accessible, you reduce that barrier. And by doing that, you enabled me to be what I want to be, which is a geoscientist. So I think that really shows the power, or the potential power, of making fieldwork accessible. So a number of characteristics emerged from this particular field course in terms of what is an accessible field trip. So we've already talked about flexibility. Advocacy, so making sure that everybody feels comfortable and feels able to talk out for themselves and also for others. It's about sharing and valuing what everybody can bring, not just the people that are able-bodied and can get to the top of the mountain. And about choice, so offering people a range of different ways to engage with the geology and with the learning. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see, as more accessible field trips are delivered, whether these are kind of the definitive characteristics, whether they are specific to this particular experience, or whether new characteristics emerge. And I'm thinking particularly in relation to maybe residential accessible fieldworks. We might see some new characteristics coming out there. And I just wanted to leave people with this particular quote, because for me, this really sums up why I think it's important that the Geological Society have signed the Science Council's declaration, and why it's important that we brought a group of people here today to start this conversation about making fieldwork accessible within the UK and at a whole range of different levels of education. Because Everybody does have the right to an opportunity to learn and not be judged, particularly in relation to disability. So making geoscience fieldwork accessible, the challenges we've got financial challenges, we've got issues to do with benchmarking and accreditation. There are issues around design, delivery and assessment that need to be discussed, and something that I haven't really touched on, but maybe Gary will talk a little bit about in his presentation, is employer expectations. Because at the moment, employers of our geoscience graduates have certain expectations about the amount and type of fieldwork that our graduates will have done. And if we make fieldwork accessible, that may change. So there's a discussion to be had there. So those are the challenges, but we haven't really mentioned the opportunities, and I think these are really exciting. There is a real opportunity to take what we do, and within our own institutions, we know we do what we do really well, but we can do it better. It just needs us to think about these things in a different way, and to take the things that we do brilliantly and make them better by making them accessible for everybody. There's also lots of really fantastic opportunity for developing new, fully accessible field work, and this is something that I know Jackie is very keen to mention in her presentation, and also there's a poster out by the coffee from a lady from BGS, which is all about a potential location for a new site, which is really exciting. But the main thing is the opportunity for us to start working together and being more collaborative and forming partnerships between schools and universities, partnerships between different higher education institutions. We shouldn't be doing this in isolation. Forming partnerships with organisations that provide fieldwork and also collaborating with the employers of our graduates. So I think there's some great opportunities. I really believe that accessible fieldwork can be done, but it's not straightforward. And I think we should be seeing today as kind of the springboard to get these discussions going for exploring how this can be done in the future. And here's that photo again. So, just in case you've forgotten it. Couple of questions. Yeah, a couple of questions. Yeah.
The idea of taking having a specific member of staff with each student is ideal. It's great for the students. The staff will enjoy it. But money, number of staff, having enough staff, and being able to afford it is very unlikely, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's important to try and kick that discussion off today, because I think it's one of those things that we know it's on the horizon and it's going to be with us before we know it, and everyone will be thinking, oh, we haven't thought about it. So we know that this funding is going to be removed, and there are a number of different ways that I think that universities can approach that. As I said, one of the solutions may be for the universities to try to find that funding internally. But depending on how many students you have and the type of support they have, that may not be possible. If it's not possible, what are the implications? Do you just not admit the students to your course, which ethically I think you can't consider doing? Or through the design and delivery of the fieldwork, do you maybe try to explore different ways to support that student using the existing resources both within the student body and within the staff? So I absolutely agree. I have no idea what the answer to that is going to be. I think it's something that is going to be quite difficult to work through, but it is a challenge that we really do need to start talking about. Yeah. Hi.
Actually, I have a suggestion more than a question,
Brilliant.
if that's all right. And it partly answers the previous presentation questions as well about competence. So, first of all, if you're aware of this, I'm sorry to teach to the converted. I'm going to swear now in this office. The RGS, the Royal Geographical Society, have the off-site safety management course for people who wish to lead in the outdoors. It helps. That's one element of improving competence. Combined with that, the British Standards Institute have a non-statutory guidelines called BS 8848, and this is specifically designed in particular for universities for expeditions and fieldwork that sets out parameters of guidelines that are non-statutory for all institutions and commercial organisations. Using those two areas, or possible areas, and the collective thoughts and skills in this room, I'm quite sure that catalyst that you allude to at the end, there's nothing stopping organisations here in producing something similar, guideline-wise, that would be very much specific to accessibility and inclusion for not just geological fieldwork, but fieldwork in general for all students. And you have that here.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, just on the DSA, my understanding of the change is that the non-medical helpers, what it's cutting is things like note takers, but I think we should still be able to access, if someone needs a support worker to take them on things like a field trip, there still should be funding available. But I think the general cut, though, although it's a bad thing overall, one of the good things behind it is the government is urging all educational institutions to look at how they can rather focus on supporting individual students with their disability, to redesign the whole of education and teaching to make it more inclusive. And I think that's a very good thing. At the beginning today, someone mentioned the 1995 Disabled Discrimination Act. What that said is it gave public institutions 10 years to get their act together. So that was by 2005. Most of us are still breaking the law, and it is about time we got our act together, I think.
Yeah, I think have we probably, yeah.
There is a... Are you prepared to take a last question?
It's up to you, Edmund.
Ooh. Is your question brief?
It can be.
Yes, good.
I work for an exam board, and in the initial consultation that we did, it was suggested to us that one of the problems of making fieldwork compulsory was that people in the south and east of England wouldn't be able to do any because there's no geology. To what extent do you think assessment objectives drive where fieldwork is rather than learning objectives? Because we carried out consultations, 72% of all schools which teach geology responded, and of that 72%, one centre does no fieldwork.
I think that...
The question is it assessment objectives which drive the type of fieldwork we do, or is it learning objectives?
I think it's both. Certainly at higher education level, because we have the benchmarks that we need to meet, and then so that's kind of the learning objectives, and then each institution has their own way of assessing fieldwork, so the assessment objectives are kind of wrapped up with that as well. So I would say that at the moment it's driven by both. Yeah.
Can I comment that I think that that's a very valuable thing to explore in one of the breakout room conversations or over lunch, which is now going to follow.
I think that was a hint.
One, it's very important that you do talk to one another. Depending on how that conversation is going, we will regather here in the lecture room no later than 2:15. But if the conversation is beginning to falter, it will be early, but not earlier than 2 o'clock. There is some hot lunch, at least it was, it may be warm now, so please go back into the library and thank you for your contribution this morning.